Welcome to the True Crime Never Sleeps podcast. I'm your host, Larry Lewis. On today's episode of Murder Monday, we dive into the brutal slayings at the hand of a spoiled adult son. But first, we'd like to thank our sponsor, Audible, for sponsoring this episode. If you want a free audiobook of your choice, visit audibletrial.com/Larry21. Audible is home to thousands of great audiobooks from all types of genres. So check them out today, audibletrial.com/Larry21. And of course, you can be a part of the show. Send us a voicemail at 682-305-0483. Send us a comment about the current episode. Give us any thoughts, anything we missed, let us know. And you can be featured on the next episode. And now on to today's episode. Joel Guy Jr. grew up entitled to the fruits of his parents' labor. His father, Joel Guy Sr., had 3 daughters from a previous relationship. When his marriage ended, he eventually met and married Lisa Guy. They had 1 son, Joel Jr. Growing up in Tennessee, Joel Jr. was the opposite of his hardworking parents. He was lazy, had no interest in making friends, and barely liked his family, if he did at all. He was intellectually adequate, but his parents saw him as being extremely intelligent. After high school, he attended George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and then transferred after 1 semester to Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. His goal, to become a plastic surgeon. For the better part of 9 years, he remained at LSU. He never worked while a student there because he never had to. Joel Sr. and Lisa continued to support him financially. One of the most confounding aspects of this story is that Lisa actually had her paychecks made out and sent to her son. For years, her entire paycheck went to Joel Jr., who truly believed it was owed to him. They thought that once Joel Jr. went to college, he could take a large course load and graduate early if he didn't have a job and could solely focus on his studies. That would lead to their son beginning a successful career on his own. But when Joel Jr. decided he wanted to be a plastic surgeon, it made his 9 years of college understandable. And they gave him money the whole time. Then, plans changed. Joel Sr. worked as a civil engineer, but was going to be laid off. At 61 years old, he decided to retire. The couple went through their finances to figure out what they needed to do to allow Lisa to retire as well. They came to the conclusion that they would sell their house and move to Joel Sr.'s family home that was left to him. The biggest change was that they were going to cut off their son from their financial support. It was time for him to be an adult and for them to be able to enjoy the rest of their lives without that burden. Unbeknownst to them, Joel Jr. had dropped out of school already, but kept living as if he were still a student in order to get money from his parents. November 24th, 2016 was Thanksgiving Day. Joel Jr. showed up with plastic tubs full of items, which was odd, but everyone brushed it off. Joel Sr.'s 3 daughters attended the celebration at their father and stepmother's house. They found their half-brother's behavior to be unusual. He was actually socializing and playing with his nieces, even giving them some of his old toys. This baffled his half-sisters, who said that during holidays, Joel Jr. would stay in his room the entire time. But it was a nice get-together that everyone enjoyed. 2 days after Thanksgiving, Joel Jr. was at the home with his father while Lisa shopped at Walmart. He went upstairs and began stabbing him. Joel Sr. kept himself in good shape, so he fought his son after the initial attack, causing injuries to Joel's hands. He regained control of the knife and savagely stabbed his father to death, inflicting 42 wounds. A piece of the knife was left lodged in his shoulder. Then he waited for his mother to return. When Lisa entered the home, she left her groceries in the foyer and went upstairs to talk to her husband. She was met by her son, who reportedly stabbed her 31 times to her death. The attack was so brutal that it almost completely left her decapitated and 9 of her ribs severed. The savage crime had not gone exactly as planned, and a lot of cleanup was necessary. He dismembered their bodies, putting their torsos and other body parts in plastic tubs, and filled them with a concoction of different chemicals in an attempt to dispose of them. He left his father's severed hands in a praying position on the floor and put his mom's head in a covered pot full of water on the stove. Then he turned it on to boil Lisa's head. Joel Jr. set the thermostat to 90 degrees, the highest possible temperature. He believed that extreme heat would help destroy forensic evidence. Eventually, he tired of all the cleanup and thought that he needed to get his injuries treated. He left the house with his parents' bodies dissolving, his mother's head boiling on the stove, and the heat blasting throughout the home. Joel Jr. returned to Baton Rouge, where he went to get treated, thinking that was less suspicious than going to a hospital near his family home. Following the holiday, Lisa didn't show up to work, which concerned her coworkers. The police were called to do a welfare check. When they showed up, they saw that the house was for sale. They then noticed that the realtor lockbox was gone from the front door, and the lock on the back door was missing. A policeman looked into the hole and was overwhelmed by the heat and the harsh-smelling chemicals. The dog was also howling. He survived. They had probable cause and entered the house. Body camera footage showed them walking through the kitchen where Lisa's head was still boiling. Moving through the house, they saw all the groceries left on the floor and containers of chemicals throughout. Once they got upstairs, they uncovered the mess of blood and body parts. Many officers said it was the worst crime scene they'd ever experienced. Joel Jr. was tracked down at his apartment in Baton Rouge, knowing full well why the police were there. He was apprehended without incident. Investigators found notebooks that detailed his planning. They included items he needed to buy and how to dispose of their bodies. He also had thoroughly documented their assets and the money he would be set to receive. He intended to frame his father for the crime as a murder-suicide. During the investigation, they discovered that for weeks before the murder, he was seen buying all the necessary items at various stores, using cash to try to avoid detection. In 2020, Joel Guy Jr. was convicted of 2 counts of premeditated first-degree murder, 3 counts of felony murder, 2 counts of abuse of a corpse, and was sentenced to life in prison. Nobody truly knows all the details of that day because he didn't testify and has never spoken of the events. He expected that one day his parents would put a cap on the financial pipeline and proceeded to coldly hack them to death without hesitation. Let us know your thoughts on this case that we just covered in the comment section below. And as always, give us a thumbs up if you like our video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that bell notification button to be notified of future videos. And if you want to support the show, you can buy us a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/TCNS. Your support helps the channel grow, upgrade our equipment, bring in new hosts, be able to pay them, and hopefully one day take this show on the road. And as always, thank you so much for watching and listening. We will see you next time.